Well, hello. Welcome to our continuing devotional through the book of First Timothy. We're currently in First Timothy chapter 6, and we're going to be picking it up at verse 6, where Paul's continuing his discussion about the lack of value in money and the great value in righteousness, godliness, holiness, spirituality. So let's go ahead and pick it up at verse 6, where Paul says this: "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world." So Paul says this in contrast to the previous verse, verse 5, in which there was a group of religious people, likely spiritual leaders, or those who hoped to be spiritual leaders, who were using what they perceived as spirituality as a way to get rich. They were using God as a way of gain, and so they had their whole priorities out of whack, as many people do today. The reality is more people daydream, aim for, hope to have the big financial windfall, whether that's through an inheritance, through a win at the lottery, through a successful business venture. That's their hope, that's their dream, that's their passion, that's their desire, because they believe that that's going to bring some kind of value, some kind of gain into their life. But the Bible teaches us that for a Christian, what we should be daydreaming about and hoping for and striving for and longing for with all of our hearts is godliness. Because if we have godliness, a righteous walk with God, a righteous attitude toward God, a healthy fear of God, and we have contentment where we don't have to have much, just the basics, as Paul will talk about here in a minute, that is a good place to be, both in every way, spiritually, emotionally, and so forth. So reminding us that this world is temporary. We bring nothing into it. We take nothing out of it. Let's not value the material things too much, but let's value those things that will be important after this life ends, which is godliness and contentment. And then Paul describes what he means by contentment, because a lot of people say, well, I would be content if, and what they mean is I'd be content if I had a home with a pool and 2 cars. I'd be content with a job that pays me $75,000 a year instead of $35,000 a year. But Paul makes it much simpler, and he says, listen, as a Christian, if verse 8 says, but if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Now, I understand cultures change, and in our culture, we might have reworded that a little bit. You know, we need shelter, and we need electricity. But what Paul is saying here is not just that we only need physically food and we only need clothing and nothing else. He's saying if we have the basics of life, that's enough. We don't have to buy into the materialistic mindset that's so thrust upon us by the media and by this world and by the culture in America, that you have to have the next, the biggest, the greatest, and more and more and more, whether it's a gadget, whether it's a home, whether it's the type of clothing, designer clothing, whether it's just, you could put something on that list there. And the reason we want that kind of contentment is not only is that the healthy, godly thing to do, but it's dangerous to have the opposite of attitude. And that's what Paul talks about in verse 9 and 10, where he says, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving, this desire, that some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pangs. So Paul says, listen, those who desire to be rich. Now keep in mind, when he says rich, he's not thinking of how we define rich here in America. He's saying, if you're not content with the basics, those who desire more than that, you're being set up to fall into a temptation, because now opportunities are going to come along that are going to be either immoral or spiritually detrimental, and they're traps. And many senseless, verse 9, many senseless and harmful desires come along, and they plunge people, not into a healthy place, but into ruin and destruction, which is why Paul says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. That desire for more material goods, more things, a more carefree, easier material life is the root of all kinds of problems in our world in our relationships in our life. And sometimes it even leads people to stray from their fundamental, most important commitment to Christ. So consider these things. Make sure that that desire is not ruling your life, but rather you have godliness as your prime desire. You're content. And if you have the basics in life, that's enough because you have Jesus and he's the greatest treasure of all. Have a blessed day.